Hello AP World History students, Mr. Lassiter here, and in this video we're taking a look at Period 6, Key Concept 6.3, New Conceptualizations of Global Economy, Society, and Culture. This is the 17th and final video in the series set for your AP World History test review. Hopefully it is helpful to you. Let's get right to it, keeping in mind that in the description down below you have review packets, which should be helpful in organizing this information and preparing for your AP World History exam. These videos are meant to be an overview, so if you have more in-depth questions, I advise you to take a look at AP Worldopedia or Freemanpedia, two of my absolute favorite websites, which are not affiliated with these, but they can help you get more information. Additionally, ask your teacher or go to your textbook, but until then, let's take a look. Key Concept 6.3 says that the role of the state in the domestic economy varied, and new institutions of global association emerged and continued to develop throughout the century. So when we look at this key concept, the first thing we tend to think about is the role of the state. And states responded in a variety of ways to the economic challenges of the 20th century. In communist states, like the Soviet Union and China, governments controlled their national economies, meaning they planned them out and decided generally how they would work. And often this was through repressive policies and some policies with negative repercussions for their own populations. Some examples that we have of communist governments controlling their economies are seen here in these propaganda images. On the left, Stalin's 5-year plans, which industrialized Russia very quickly, although his policies of collectivization were utter failures and led to starvation in the Ukraine. Mao's Great Leap Forward saw similar results, ultimately being a disaster for the Chinese peasant population, although that was the group that he was trying most to support. But these communist controls over the economy are going to be a theme throughout, especially the second half of the 20th century as communism grows in the world following World War II and Soviet influence, especially in Eastern Europe. Following World War I and the onset of the Great Depression, some governments which had beforehand not taken an active role became more active in economic life. We see this, for example, in the United States with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal for America, in which the United States government, practicing Keynesian economics with deficit spending, sought to put a shot in the arm for the American economy, also creating many different programs to put Americans to work for the relief, recovery, and reform. The fascist governments, for example, the fascist government of Italy, practiced corporatism, taking an active role in economic life, trying to get all sectors of the economy to work together under control of the state for the glory of the state and for the success of all. And then we also see some governments in Latin America, like Brazil and Mexico, turning to popularist governments which sought to reform the economies within their countries, in some cases even redistributing land or nationalizing industries like the oil industry in Mexico in order to stimulate the economy within those countries. We also see newly independent states, governments taking a strong role in guiding economic life to promote development. In Egypt, for example, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who you see pictured on the far left, wanted to see more economic development in Egypt. In some cases, he used the Cold War to help with economic development projects like the construction of the Aswan High Dam. He also nationalizes the Suez Canal to promote the growth of the Egyptian economy. In India, Nehru sets up a planned economy for India. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere promotes socialist reforms in order to stimulate the economy of Tanzania. In a trend accelerated by the end of the Cold War, we also see that many governments encouraged free market economic policies and promoted what is called economic liberalization in the late 20th century. And these are several of the governments that promote some of these free market policies. The United States under Ronald Reagan, Britain under Margaret Thatcher are two of the most well known. But in communist China under Deng Xiaoping, we see China begin to encourage more free market policies with, of course, government planning and government oversight. But that, of course, has stimulated the Chinese economy and made it eventually what is today the fastest growing economy in the world. Even the country of Chile under Pinochet was known for this as well. In the late 20th century, we see revolutions in information and communications technology lead to the growth of knowledge economies, too, in some regions. While industrial production, as the key concepts tell us, and manufacturing were increasingly situated in developing economies, including the Pacific Rim and Latin America. Now, what does that key concept mean? Well, it means that in some regions we continue to see the growth of these economies, especially stimulated by technology, but industrial production and manufacturing are not necessarily going to stay rooted in some of the traditional industrial powers, like, let's say, the United States and Britain. Instead, we'll see those moved. Sometimes we call that offshoring or outsourcing of these industries. And we see industrial production and manufacturing going up in places like Mexico, where many United States automobile factories are found. And we see the production of many of our electronics in places like Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, and China, those Pacific Rim nations. And this has also has stimulated some of these other economies around the world, also resulting in greater integration of what becomes a global economy in this time period. Now, as we continue with key concept 6.3 and we move on to Roman numeral 2, we see that states, communities, and individuals become increasingly interdependent in this time, a process facilitated by the growth of institutions of global governance. And so when we think about institutions of global governance, we're thinking of new international organizations which are formed. Some of these are formed to maintain world peace and some to facilitate international cooperation. And again, we're not just thinking of what this looks like after World War II. This unit covers our the entirety of the 20th and what we've had of the 21st century so far. And so we have to look back to first attempts at this with the League of Nations, which was around from 1920 to 1946. The United Nations comes to mind. And even organizations of cooperation that are formed more recently, like the International Criminal Court, which was founded in 2002. This international cooperation has allowed for advancements in other realms, including economic advancements. And this growth of interdependence has stimulated changing economics in our world. Changing economic institutions and regional trade agreements reflected the spread of principles and practices associated with free market economics throughout the world. So some examples of changing economic institutions that we see in this time period include things like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, also the World Trade Organization. These economic institutions are in place in order to try to provide support for new and developing economies, as well as facilitate trade around the world, free market trade, and to try to reduce some of those trade barriers. We see especially with the World Trade Organization, although they are not without their detractors. We also see multinational corporations become important for thinking about free market economics throughout the world and that interdependentness of nations' economies, right? So a company like Nestle, for example, they are not only going to impact the bottom lines of investors in the first world, but they also might affect the cocoa farmers in a developing nation. And as I mentioned, of course, regional trade agreements also reflect this spread of principles and practices of free market economics, whether it's the European Economic Community, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, or the Association of South Asian Nations, or something like Mercosur in South America. Regional trade agreements have been established around the world in order to promote free trade and try to reduce some of the barriers in this world that is becoming ever more economically interdependent. As I said, not all of these movements are without their detractors. Movements throughout the world protested inequality, especially in relation to the environment, which we talked about in Key Concept 6.1, and economic consequences of this global integration. So this global integration oftentimes is, many people believe, unfairly impact the developing world, the third world it might be called, or the global south, with negative environmental impacts, for example, the production of palm oil. And so groups and individuals have promoted alternatives. We see, of course, Earth Day become a global, April 27th become kind of a global marker of care for the earth. The Greenbelt movement in Kenya is another example, and Greenpeace, another worldwide example of movements which are trying to point out some of the inequality in these consequences that come along with global integration. And as the last of these key concepts, or the second to last of these key concepts, Roman numeral 3, we see that people conceptualize society and culture in new ways in the 20th and 21st centuries. Rights-based discourses challenged old assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. Some of these can be seen on this page. These challenges were seen in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, especially thinking in terms of rights for children, women, and refugees. These international organizations, which help to create this interdependence, also can stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. You've also seen a rise in global feminism movements, a rise in one movement in the 20th century. We saw, for example, the Negritude movement, which started among the French African diaspora. Liberation theology in Latin America, changing assumptions about class and religion. And then Islamic renewal movements, which we see in places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia in the 1960s and 70s. In much of the world, access to education as well as participation in new political and professional roles became more inclusive in terms of these factors. And so, in addition to thinking about challenges to assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion, we also want to think about how many underrepresented groups have gained increased access to new roles in education, politics, or the professional sector. For example, women literacy, female literacy, and women in higher education has been increasing steadily in the 20th century. There is, in the 20th century, we also see women gaining more access in the political realm. Suffrage granted, for example, in the United States in 1920, Brazil 1932, Japan 1945, India 1947, Turkey 1934, Morocco 1963. And so the idea that women can take more of a role in political life and even hold office. In the United States, also, we see changes politically for especially minority groups, African Americans mostly, with the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Two pieces of legislation which formally allowed the federal government to enforce some of the constitutional guarantees of the post-Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. In South Africa in the 1990s, we see the end of apartheid, allowing black South Africans to participate in the political realm, leading to the election of South Africa's first black president, Nelson Mandela. And here you see him with F.W. de Klerk, the president who worked with Mandela and others to end the system of apartheid. And in India, we also see increased access in certain areas, especially in education, as the caste and reservation system was set up under the Indian Constitution of 1950. And you can think of this sort of like affirmative action for some castes who had historically been underrepresented or not allowed to participate in some realms of life in India, especially education. And now, here we arrive at our last key concept. 6.3, Roman numeral 4. And if we think about this interdependentness and this increasing globalization in the world, in world economies, world society, and culture, we start to see that these political and social changes led to changes in arts and literature. In the second half of the century, especially, popular and consumer culture becomes much more global. Oftentimes we think of this as westernization or Americanization, where American and Western culture has come to dominate much of this of culture or popular culture around the globe. As we see the spread of free markets and the spread of certain types of music or art or whatever it might be. And so we have several examples of this global culture. One, of course, being, for example, the worldwide popularity of reggae music, which is something that comes out of the Caribbean. Movies and the motion picture industry. We see this global culture be picked up not just with Hollywood movies, but movies out of India, part of the Bollywood movie industry. We also see this with sports, World Cup soccer, the Olympics. These are things that are global phenomena around the world. Now, if we think about consumer culture, we also see things like McDonald's gain global popularity. And we can even think beyond that with art and literature, music. It is a truly global world. Whether you are one of the 3.1 billion viewers of Psy's Gangnam Style video, or you're one of the hundreds of millions who've read Harry Potter books, which has been translated into over 74 languages, whether or not you are an admirer of the street art of Banksy, all of these have become global phenomena. And our world is only getting more integrated. And so as you go to YouTube and you're watching the same video as someone halfway around the world as you, or you're watching this video in whatever country you are to study for your AP World History exam, the world is now more connected than ever. And because of that, I've been able to bring you this series looking at the AP World History exam. I hope that it has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. And I hope that you share this with others if you find it helpful. Best of luck on your AP World History exam, and we'll see you in our next video.